A look at Halifax this morning. In just a few hours, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will arrive in the city. He's expected to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney. That stopover comes as Zelenskyy makes his way to the United States for talks with Donald Trump aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Now, today's meeting with Carney comes just hours after a major Russian attack on Kyiv overnight, with Ukrainian officials reporting hundreds of missiles and drones launched at the capital. Good morning, I'm Angie Seth, and you're watching CBC News Network. And as we mentioned, they were just hours away from that meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Mark Carney. CBC's JP Tasker joining us from Washington, watching things from that side of the pond, if you will. So, JP, let's talk about first what's going to be happening here. This meeting between Zelenskyy and Carney. What can we expect?
Yeah, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney in Halifax early this afternoon, a stopover before a high-stakes negotiation with U.S. President Donald Trump in Florida tomorrow. This is the fourth time Carney and Zelenskyy have met this year, and the two spoke by phone yesterday. Zelenskyy was updating Carney on his push for a resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, outlining what he wants to see from the United States, but also the coalition of the willing, that 35-member group that is filled with nations that are friendly to Ukraine, including countries like Canada, of course. The Prime Minister's office sent us a readout of that call. They say Carney commended the president for his continued efforts to find a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. And he also commended the courage of the Ukrainian people as they face another winter of Russian aggression. Carney also vowed to maintain pressure on Vladimir Putin to negotiate an end to that conflict that has dragged on now for nearly 4 years. So I expect they'll be discussing these issues and more in Halifax later this afternoon.
Indeed, we could be looking at a number of things. Sanctions, we know that's something that's been on the table before, JP. So let's shift over now, because that conversation very important. But then, of course, leading into what we're going to see happening tomorrow with Donald Trump in Florida and that meeting taking place. We know Zelenskyy has talked about this, and he told this to Mark Carney that, you know, the agreement is almost there. We're hoping to fully get it there with that conversation with Donald Trump. What are you watching for on that front?
Yeah, Zelenskyy is looking for security guarantees from his allies, binding commitments to provide financial, military, intelligence support to deter future Russian aggression if that pops up. They want help in creating essentially a defense shield, long-term arms, training, cyber defense, and potential rapid military action if attacked again by Putin and his forces. Zelenskyy also wants help from Western allies for the country's reconstruction. You know, Ukraine, of course, has been bombarded for years. A lot of work is needed to return to a sense of normalcy when this conflict winds down. There's also the issue of territory. Russia wants Ukraine to give up some land in the east, in the Donbass. Zelenskyy has long opposed that, but he seems to have softened his stance somewhat in recent days. He's now saying a demilitarized economic zone in contested areas. Maybe that's something that could be implemented. And while the Ukraine president says a deal with the U.S. on these issues is 90% complete, and he actually told reporters on the plane over here this morning he is sure compromise can be found, it's really up to Trump. And Trump has been non-committal so far. He told reporters last night that Zelenskyy doesn't have anything until I approve it. And then there's Russia and their willingness to cut a deal. Putin, of course, as you mentioned, pulverized Kyiv last night, launching a wave of drones and missile attacks on the capital. That does not look like the actions of a peacemaker.
We'll be watching things very, very closely on this, as you mentioned there, that meeting with Mark Carney happening this afternoon, and then, of course, the other crucial meeting happening with Donald Trump tomorrow. CBC's JP Tasker for us in Washington. Thanks for this, JP.
Thank you.
Well, diplomacy offers little immediate relief for people on the ground in Ukraine now, despite the renewed push for peace. Early this morning, as you heard JP talk about, Russia bombarded Kyiv with hundreds of missiles and drones. CBC World Report co-host John Northcott following those details for us from London. So, John, we heard from JP in terms of the meetings taking place, but that, of course, on the sidelines of that, we're seeing more attacks happening overnight.
And so you have to ask the question whether or not this is a message being sent by Russia to the West, aware that these meetings were certainly underway between perhaps Mark Carney. We know that meetings, whether the Russians knew that or not, so the question, they certainly knew there was something planned with Trump. Calls underway with European leaders as well today, and a message from the skies with, and you look at the exact numbers here, some 500 drones and 40 missiles, according to Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Hypersonic, ballistic, and cruise missiles happening around 1 a.m. local time, people taking to shelters, into the subways. And while people are still being searched for in the rubble, and there were confirmed injuries, no deaths so far, yet what we are seeing is significant infrastructure damage. It is around 0 degrees in Kyiv, and we are seeing the heat out in nurseries, in schools, large stretches of the city with the heat being off, electrical infrastructure affected as well on all of this. Now, Zelenskyy, quick to respond to this, pointing out that it is the holiday season, and presumably against this backdrop of furious diplomacy that is taking place in many places around the world, he referred to the Russian actions as sick, saying that if the world wants to know what Russia's approach to peace is in Ukraine, all they have to do is consider the missiles and the missiles that dropped last night on the city of Kyiv. So the Russian effort still very much on a war footing, although it's you have to point out that back and forth all week there have been attacks on each other's infrastructure, much of it around oil and gas, much of it around supplies that could be used like diesel and jet fuel that could be used by their respective militaries. So still very much a hot war as the world is hoping for some cool heads to prevail at discussions over, as they say, the next 2 days, and who knows beyond in terms of what the world of diplomacy will offer heading into the new year.
And we'll be watching it all very closely. John, thank you so much for this. World Report co-host John Northcott for us in London.